The morning sun had barely risen over Vienna when the bus from the airport pulled into the station. Among the passengers stepping off was a girl who looked no older than 16. She carried a small backpack that had seen better days, and in her hand was a crumpled piece of paper with an address written on it. Her name was Lena, and she had traveled alone for nearly 30 hours from a small coastal town in the SS Fascuda in the But Vienna was nothing like home. The buildings here were tall and old, made of stone that had stood for hundreds of years. Back in her town, the houses were made of wood and concrete, and the streets were dusty and loud with tricycles and vendors selling fish. Here, everything felt quiet and serious. The whole city was holding its breath. Lena found a bench near the station and sat down. She pulled out a small photo from her pocket. It showed her grandmother sitting at an old piano, her fingers resting on the keys. That piano had belonged to the local church, and it was where Lena had learned to play. 3 of its keys were broken and never made a sound. But she had practiced on it every single day since she was 5 years old. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago. Before she died, she made Lena promise one thing. She said that Lena had a gift, something rare, and that she must never waste it. She told her to go out into the world and show people what music could do when it came from the heart. Lena wiped her eyes and put the photo back in her pocket. She had no money left after the plane ticket and the bus fare. Her family had saved for 3 years to send her here. Her mother worked double shifts at a factory. Her father sold vegetables at the market before dawn every morning. Her younger brother gave up his birthday money. They all believed in her, even when she sometimes doubted herself. The address on the paper led her to a building that looked like a palace. It was the Hartwell Conservatory, one of the most famous music schools in the world. Students who trained here went on to perform in the greatest concert halls across Europe and America. The entrance had tall columns and wide steps. Above the door was a golden sign with the school's name carved into it. Lena stood there for a long time just looking. She had seen pictures of this place online, but standing in front of it was something else. It felt impossible that someone like her could walk through those doors. She was not from a wealthy family. She had no famous teacher. She had never won a single competition because there were no competitions in her small town. All she had was the music inside her and the memory of her grandmother's voice telling her she was meant for something more. She took a deep breath and walked. Inside, the entrance hall was filled with young people her age, but they looked nothing like her. They wore expensive clothes and carried instrument cases that probably cost more than her family earned in a year. They spoke in different languages, laughing and greeting each other like old friends. Many of them had been training since they were children, studying under teachers whose names Lena had only read about in articles online. A woman at the front desk handed her a number and told her to wait in the main hall. The auditions would begin soon. Lena found a seat in the corner, away from the others, and watched quietly. She noticed a boy tuning a violin that gleamed under the lights. A girl nearby was stretching her fingers, her nails perfectly shaped, her hands soft and uncalloused. Lena looked down at her own hands. They were rough from years of washing dishes and helping with chores. Her nails were short, cut unevenly because she did it herself. But these hands had played music since before she could read. These hands had learned to make that old, broken piano sing. The auditions were held in a grand room with high ceilings and a stage at the front. On the stage sat a single grand piano, black and polished, more beautiful than any instrument Lena had ever seen. She felt her heart beat faster just looking at it. At a long table in front of the stage sat 4 judges. 3 of them were looking through papers and whispering to each other. But the 4th judge sat apart, his arms crossed, his face like stone. He was an older man, with silver hair swept back from his forehead, sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Lena heard whispers around her. That was Maestro Victor Harlow. He was a legend. People said he had once been the greatest pianist of his generation, performing in sold-out halls across the world. But he had stopped performing years ago, and no one knew exactly why. Now he taught at the conservatory, but he was known for being harsh. He had dismissed students in the middle of their auditions. He had made grown adults cry with a single sentence. He believed that music was not for everyone. He had no patience for those he considered unworthy. Lena watched him as other students performed. He barely looked at most of them. Sometimes he would shake his head before they even finished playing. Once, he held up his hand and told a boy to stop halfway through a piece. The boy walked off the stage with red eyes. His dreams crushed in less than 2 minutes. When Lena's number was finally called, her legs felt weak. She walked to the stage, and the grand piano seemed to grow larger with every step. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it carefully. The keys were smooth and perfect under her fingers. So different from the old piano at the church, Maestro Harlow glanced at her file. She saw his eyebrows rise slightly. Then he looked up at her, and his expression was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind. "No formal training," he read aloud. "No competition history. Your recommendation comes from a church organist in a town I've never heard of." He set the file down and leaned back in his chair. "You have 3 minutes. I suggest you do not waste them." Lena nodded. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. For a moment, she was not in Vienna anymore. She was back in that small church, sitting next to her grandmother, learning to play by ear because they could not afford sheet music. She remembered the sound of rain on the tin roof. She remembered her grandmother humming along as Lena played, and then she began. She chose a piece by Chopin, one of his ballades. It was a piece that told a story without words, a story of longing and loss and hope. Lena poured everything into it, every sacrifice her family had made, every hour she had spent practicing on that broken piano, every dream she had carried across the ocean to this moment. The room went quiet. Even the students who had been whispering stopped to listen. The other judges leaned forward in their seats. But Lena did not notice any of this. She was lost in the music, letting it flow through her like a river finding its way to the sea. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes and looked at Maestro Harlow. His expression had not changed. He sat perfectly still, watching her with those sharp eyes, and then slowly picked up her file again and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. The silence stretched on. Lena waited, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly on the keys. She had given everything she had. Now, all she could do was hope it was enough. The silence in the room felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Lena kept her hands on the piano keys, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. She had played her heart out. Now she waited for the verdict that would decide her future. Maestro Harlow sat completely still. His face gave away nothing. The other 3 judges exchanged glances with each other, their expressions uncertain. One of them, a woman with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, looked like she wanted to say something, but she stayed quiet. Everyone in that room knew that only one opinion truly mattered. Finally, the maestro moved. He reached up slowly and removed his glasses. He pulled a small cloth from his pocket and began to polish the lenses, taking his time as if Lena was not even there. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. When he put his glasses back on, he looked at her the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. Not with anger, but with disappointment. With the kind of tired frustration that came from seeing the same mistake over and over again. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm and cold. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Lena swallowed hard. "At my church, sir. My grandmother taught me. And I watched videos online to learn new pieces." A few students in the audience laughed quietly. Lena felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes on the maestro. She would not look away. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her shame. Maestro Harlow nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he already suspected. "I thought so," he said. "You play like someone who learned from a screen. There is emotion, yes. I will give you that. But emotion without structure is just noise. Passion without discipline is meaningless. It is like a fire without a hearth. It burns bright for a moment, and then it destroys everything around it." He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on hers. "This conservatory does not exist to nurture dreamers. We are not here to give false hope to talented amateurs. We produce artists, professionals, musicians, who will carry the legacy of the masters into the next generation." He paused, letting his words sink in. You are not ready for this place. Perhaps you never will be. The words hit Lena like stones thrown at her chest. She felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of all these people, not in front of him. One of the other judges, a man with kind eyes and a round face, cleared his throat. Maestro, if I may, the technical execution was quite impressive for someone without formal training. Perhaps with guidance, she could what? Maestro Harlow cut him off without even looking at him. Could learn what these other students have spent their entire lives mastering? Could catch up to prodigies who have trained under the finest teachers in Europe since they were children? He shook his head. Hope is a beautiful thing, but it does not belong in an audition room. Only truth belongs here. And the truth is that this girl has dreams that are far above her station. Lena felt something shift inside her. The sadness was still there, but now something else was rising alongside it. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something quieter, but stronger. It was the same feeling she had when her grandmother first told her she had a gift. It was the feeling of knowing something that others could not see. She looked at Maestro Harlow and spoke before she could stop herself. May I play one more piece? The room went completely silent. Even the students who had been whispering stopped. No one ever spoke back to the maestro. No one ever asked for a second chance after he had already passed judgment. Maestro Harlow stared at her. For a moment something flickered in his eyes. It might have been surprise. It might have been curiosity. Or it might have been annoyance at this girl who did not know her place. You have already had your 3 minutes, he said. The audition is over. I know, Lena said. Her voice was steady now, steadier than she expected. But I came a long way to be here. My family gave up everything they had so I could sit at this piano. I am not asking for pity. I am not asking for special treatment. I am only asking for one more chance to show you what I can do. She paused, gathering her courage. If you still think I do not belong here after that, I will leave. I will not argue. I will not complain. But please, sir, let me try one more time. The other judges looked at Maestro Harlow, waiting. The students in the audience held their breath. The whole room seemed frozen in that single moment. Maestro Harlow leaned back in his chair. A thin smile appeared on his lips, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who is about to watch a bird fly into a window. Very well, he said. One more piece. But I warn you, girl. If you waste my time again, you will regret it. Lena nodded. She turned back to the piano and placed her hands on the keys. Her mind raced through all the pieces she knew, all the songs she had taught herself over the years. She needed something that would make him see, something that would prove she was more than just a dreamer with rough hands and a broken piano, and then she knew. There was one piece she had been practicing in secret for the past 2 years, a piece so difficult that most professional pianists avoided it, a piece that required not just skill, but a kind of fearless precision that few people possessed. It was called La Combunella, composed by Franz Liszt, one of the greatest pianists who ever lived. The name meant the little bell, but there was nothing little about it. It was a monster of a composition, filled with impossible jumps across the keyboard, notes that had to be struck faster than the eye could follow, and passages that demanded hands stretch wider than most hands could reach. Lena had never performed it for anyone. She had only played it alone late at night when the church was empty and no one could hear her mistakes. But she had practiced it so many times that her fingers knew it by heart. Every note, every pause, every breath. She did not know if she could play it perfectly, but she knew she had to try. What Lena did not know, and what no one in that room would ever tell her, was that La Campanella had a special meaning for Maestro Harlow. Years ago, at the height of his career, he had been preparing to perform it at a major concert in Berlin. It was supposed to be his greatest triumph. But just weeks before the performance, he suffered an injury to his left hand. The doctors said it would heal, but it never fully did. He lost the flexibility needed to execute the most demanding passages of the piece. He never performed it in public. He never even tried again. La Campanella became his ghost. The one piece that defeated him. The one failure he never spoke about but never forgot, and now, This 16-year-old girl from a tiny town in the Philippines was about to attempt what he could not. Lena closed her eyes. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of her mother working double shifts under harsh factory lights. She thought of her father waking up before the sun to sell vegetables in the cold morning air. She thought of her little brother handing over his birthday money with a smile on his face. They had all believed in her. Now it was time to believe in herself. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys, and then she began to play. The first notes floated into the air like bells ringing from a distant church tower. Soft, delicate, almost fragile. It was the sound that gave the piece its name, La Campanella, the little bell. But anyone who knew this composition understood that the gentle opening was a trick. It was the calm before a storm that few pianists could survive. Lena's fingers moved across the keys with a lightness that made it look effortless. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying gently with the rhythm. She was not thinking about the audience. She was not thinking about the judges. She was not even thinking about Maestro Harlow and his cold, dismissive words. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world where only the music existed. In the audience, students began to shift in their seats. Some of them recognized the piece immediately. A girl in the front row leaned over to her friend and whispered something. The friend's eyes went wide. Word spread quickly through the room, passed from one person to the next like a secret too big to keep. She is playing La Campanella. The girl from the Philippines is playing La Campanella. At the judges' table, the woman with gray hair sat up straighter. The kind-faced man set down his pen and stared at the stage. Even the fourth judge, who had been checking his phone under the table, looked up with sudden interest, but it was Maestro Harlow's reaction that no one expected. The moment Lena began to play, something changed in his face. The cold confidence that had been there just seconds ago melted away. In its place was something raw and unguarded. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, slowly curled into fists. His jaw tightened. His eyes never left the girl at the piano. He knew this piece better than anyone in the room. He had spent years studying it, practicing it, dreaming of the day he would perform it on the world's greatest stages. He remembered the hours he had spent at the piano, pushing his hands to their limits, trying to master passages that seemed designed to break the human body. He remembered the excitement he felt when he finally got it right, when every note fell perfectly into place, like pieces of a puzzle, coming together, and he remembered the day it was all taken from him. The injury had seemed minor at first. A strain in his left hand from too much practice. The doctors told him to rest for a few weeks, and he did. But when he returned to the piano, something was wrong. His hand would not move the way it used to. The flexibility was gone. The speed was gone. No matter how hard he tried, he could not reach the notes the way he once could. He had tried everything. Different doctors. Different treatments. Months of therapy. Nothing worked. The damage was permanent. And with it, his dream of performing La Campanella died. He never spoke about it. He buried that failure deep inside himself, locked it away where no one could see. He told himself it did not matter. He was still a great pianist. He was still respected. He still had his reputation, his students, his legacy. But late at night when he was alone, he would sometimes sit at his piano and try to play those opening notes. And every time, his hand would fail him. Every time, he would be reminded of what he had lost. Now watching this teenage girl play the piece that had defeated him, Maestro Harlow felt something he had not felt in years. It was not anger. It was not jealousy. It was something much worse. It was grief. Lena moved into the faster sections of the piece, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Her right hand danced across the upper keys, striking notes so quickly that they blurred together into a shimmering waterfall of sound. Her left hand jumped back and forth across the keyboard, covering distances that seemed impossible, landing on each note with perfect precision. This was where most pianists stumbled. This was where the piece showed no mercy. The jumps were too wide. The timing was too tight. One small mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the whole performance would collapse like a house of cards. But Lena did not stumble. She did not hesitate. Her hands moved as if they had been born for this moment, as if the piano was not a separate instrument but an extension of her own body. She played with a freedom that most musicians spend their entire lives trying to achieve. A student in the back row whispered to his neighbor, "How is she doing this?" She said she learned from YouTube. His neighbor shook her head, unable to answer. There was no explanation for what they were witnessing. Talent could be taught. Technique could be developed. But what Lena was showing them was something beyond training. It was something that came from a place that could not be reached through practice alone. The piece built toward its most demanding passage. This was the section that Maestro Harlow had never been able to play after his injury. It required the left hand to stretch across nearly 2 octaves, while maintaining a delicate melody in the upper register. It was the moment that separated the great pianists from the legendary ones. Lena's left hand stretched across the keys, her fingers spread wide, reaching for notes that seemed too far apart to touch. For a single heartbeat, it looked like she might not make it. Her hand trembled slightly. The audience tensed, and then she hit every note perfectly. The sound that filled the room was pure and clear, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. The melody sang out above the cascading notes below, beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. It was the sound of triumph. The sound of someone who had refused to give up. Maestro Harlow closed his eyes. He could not watch anymore. The music washed over him, and for a moment, he was not a judge at an audition. He was a young man again, sitting in a practice room, falling in love with this piece for the first time. He remembered why he had become a musician. He remembered the joy of discovering that music could express things that words never could. He had forgotten that joy somewhere along the way. The years of teaching, the disappointments, the bitterness over his injury, it had all piled up inside him until he could no longer see past it. He had become hard and cold because it was easier than admitting how much he had lost. But this girl, this child from a place he had never heard of, was reminding him of everything he had tried to forget. Lena entered the final section of the piece. The music soared higher, the notes tumbling over each other in a glorious rush toward the ending. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed that seemed almost superhuman. The bell-like sounds rang out again and again, faster and faster, building to a climax that made the air itself seem to vibrate. And then, with one final flourish, she struck the last chord. The sound hung in the air for a long moment. Slowly fading into silence, Lena opened her eyes. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked out at the audience and saw faces staring back at her with expressions she could not read. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own breathing. She turned to look at the judges' table. The woman with gray hair had tears in her eyes. The kind-faced man was nodding slowly, his mouth slightly open. The 4th judge had put down his phone and was staring at her like he had just witnessed something impossible. And Maestro Harlow, he sat perfectly still, his eyes now open, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. His face was pale. His hands were still curled into fists. He looked like a man who had just been shown a ghost. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbearable. Lena waited. She had given everything she had. Every ounce of her strength. Every piece of her heart. There was nothing left to give. Now all she could do was wait for him to speak. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Nobody in the audition hall dared to make a sound. It was as if the music had cast a spell over everyone, and they were all afraid that the smallest movement might break it. Lena sat at the piano, her hands resting on her lap now, her fingers still trembling from the effort of what she had just done. She could feel sweat on the back of her neck. Her arms ached. Playing La Campanella required every muscle in her hands, her wrists, her forearms. It was like running a marathon with her fingers. But she had made it to the end. She had played every note. Now she just needed to know if it was enough. She looked at Maestro Harlow, searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. But his expression was impossible to read. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at her with those sharp eyes that had terrified her just minutes ago. Only now, something was different. The coldness was gone. In its place was something she could not name. It almost looked like pain. The woman judge with gray hair was the first to break the silence. She leaned toward the microphone in front of her and cleared her throat softly. "That was," she began, then stopped. She shook her head slightly, as if she could not find the right words. "That was extraordinary." The kind-faced man nodded eagerly. "I have heard that piece performed by some of the finest pianists in the world," he said. "Concert hall veterans. Competition winners. And I can honestly say that what we just witnessed belongs in that company. Perhaps even above it." The fourth judge, the one who had been looking at his phone earlier, leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "I don't know what to say. I really don't. That was something else." But Maestro Harlow said nothing. He had not moved since Lena finished playing. He sat like a statue, his hands still curled into fists on the table. His eyes still fixed on the girl at the piano. The other judges exchanged uncertain glances. They were not used to seeing the maestro like this. He always had something to say. He was never at a loss for words. His opinions came quick and sharp, like blades cutting through the air. But now he was silent, and that silence was more unsettling than any criticism could have been. Lena felt her heart sinking. She had hoped that her performance would change something. She had hoped that the music would speak louder than her lack of credentials, her lack of training, her lack of everything that seemed to matter in this place. But maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the maestro's silence meant that even this was not enough. She began to stand up from the piano bench, ready to accept defeat with whatever dignity she had left. But before she could move, Maestro Harlow raised his hand. "Wait," he said. His voice was different now. It was quieter, softer. The sharp edge that had been there before had disappeared. He sounded like a man who had just woken up from a long, troubled sleep. Lena sat back down, her heart pounding. Maestro Harlow slowly uncurled his fists and placed his palms flat on the table. He looked down at his own hands for a long moment, and something crossed his face. It might have been sadness. It might have been regret. Then he looked back up at Lena. "Do you know why I stopped performing?" he asked. The question caught everyone off guard. The other judges turned to look at him with surprise. Students in the audience leaned forward, suddenly very interested. The maestro never talked about his past. He never explained himself to anyone. Lena shook her head slowly. "No, sir, I don't." Maestro Harlow nodded as if he expected that answer. 23 years ago, I was preparing for the most important concert of my career. I was going to perform La Campanella in Berlin, at a hall where Liszt himself once played. It was supposed to be the highlight of my life. The moment when everything I had worked for would finally come together. He paused, and Lena saw him swallow hard. This was not easy for him. Whatever he was about to say had been locked away for a very long time. 3 weeks before the concert, I injured my hand. The doctor said it was minor. They said I would recover. But they were wrong. He held up his left hand and looked at it with an expression that was almost gentle, almost forgiving. The damage was permanent. I lost the flexibility I needed to play the most demanding pieces. I could still perform many things, but La Campanella was beyond me. It has been beyond me ever since. The room was completely silent. Even the students who had been whispering among themselves were still now, hanging on every word. Maestro Harlow lowered his hand and looked at Lena. "For 23 years, that piece has haunted me. It was the one mountain I could never climb, the one dream I could never reach. And over time, that failure poisoned me. It made me bitter. It made me cruel. I told myself that I was being honest when I dismissed students who did not meet my standards. But the truth is, I was punishing them for having something I had lost. I was punishing them for still being able to dream." Lena felt tears forming in her eyes, but she did not look away. She understood now. She understood why he had been so harsh with her. It was not because he thought she was worthless. It was because she reminded him of the person he used to be. Maestro Harlow stood up from his chair. The other judges watched him with wide eyes, uncertain of what was happening. This was not how auditions worked. This was not how any of this was supposed to go. He walked around the table and approached the stage. His steps were slow and measured, like a man walking toward something he had been running from for a very long time. When he reached the edge of the stage, he stopped and looked up at Lena. "I have spent 2 decades teaching students how to play," he said. "I have taught them technique. I have taught them discipline. I have taught them how to read music and how to perform under pressure. But somewhere along the way, I forgot the most important thing." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I forgot what it means to love music." Lena felt a tear slip down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. Maestro Harlow reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He looked at it for a moment, then held it up toward her. It was a small gesture, almost awkward, but it carried more meaning than any words could have. "You played that piece better than I ever could," he said. "Even before my injury, even when I was at my best, you played it with something I never had. You played it with your soul." He lowered the handkerchief and let out a long breath. For the first time since the audition began, he looked like a human being instead of a judge. He looked tired. He looked old. But he also looked like someone who had just set down a heavy burden he had been carrying for far too long. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for today, but for the person I have become. You came here with nothing but your talent and your courage, and I almost sent you away because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me." Lena did not know what to say. Her throat was tight. Her heart was full. She had come to Vienna hoping for a chance. She had never expected this. Maestro Harlow turned to look at the other judges. They were staring at him with expressions of disbelief. He gave them a small nod, then turned back to Lena. "The audition is not over," he said, "but I think we have seen enough." He reached out his hand toward her and Lena, the girl from the small coastal town, the girl who had learned to play on a broken piano in a tiny church, reached out and took it. When Lena took Maestro Harlow's hand, something shifted in the room. It was not just the silence breaking or the tension releasing. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of 2 worlds coming together, of a bridge being built between the past and the future. The maestro helped her down from the stage, and for a moment they stood face to face. He was so much taller than her, and up close she could see the lines on his face, the weariness in his eyes. But she could also see something else. She could see hope. It was faint, like a small flame that had almost gone out, but it was there. "Welcome to the Hartwell Conservatory," he said. His voice was steady now, but there was warmth in it that had not been there before. "I would be honored to be your teacher if you will have me." Lena did not trust herself to speak. She nodded, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled down her cheeks. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a dream that had seemed impossible just hours ago, suddenly becoming real. The audience erupted into applause. Students who had watched her with doubt and curiosity were now on their feet, clapping and cheering. The other judges rose from their seats, smiling and nodding. Even the man who had been checking his phone was applauding loudly, shaking his head in amazement. But Lena barely heard any of it. She was thinking of her family back home. She was thinking of her mother, who would be waking up soon for another long shift at the factory. She was thinking of her father, who was probably already at the market, setting up his vegetable stand in the cold morning darkness. She was thinking of her little brother, who had given up his birthday money without a second thought because he believed in her. She wished they could be here. She wished they could see this moment. But she knew they were with her in spirit. They had always been with her, every step of the way. The rest of that day passed in a blur. There were papers to sign and forms to fill out. There were introductions to staff members and tours of the building. Lena was shown the practice rooms, the concert hall, the library filled with sheet music from composers who had lived hundreds of years ago. Everything was more beautiful and more overwhelming than she had imagined. That night, she was given a small room in the student dormitory. It was simple but clean, with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the city. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone. She had 1 bar of signal, just enough to make a call. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Lena, is that you? What happened? Did they accept you?" Lena smiled. fresh tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Mama, they accepted me. I'm in." She heard her mother cry out, then call for her father. Soon the whole family was on the phone, talking over each other, laughing and crying at the same time. Her little brother kept saying, "I knew it. I knew you could do it." Her father was too choked up to speak, but she could hear him breathing on the other end. And that was enough. When she finally hung up, Lena lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about everything that had happened. The long journey. The fear. The humiliation of being dismissed. The courage it took to ask for one more chance. And the music. Always the music. She fell asleep with a smile on her face. And for the first time in months, she did not dream of failure. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Lena's life, but also the most rewarding. Studying at Hartwell was nothing like learning on her own back home. There were classes in music theory, music history, composition, and performance. There were hours of practice every day, with teachers who pushed her to be better than she thought she could be. There were moments when she felt lost and overwhelmed, when the other students seemed so far ahead of her that she wondered if she would ever catch up. But she kept going. She woke up early and stayed up late. She practiced until her fingers ached, and then practiced some more. She asked questions when she did not understand something, even when it made her feel embarrassed. She learned that being the best was not about never struggling. It was about never giving up, and through it all, Maestro Harlow was there. He was different now. The coldness that had defined him for so many years had melted away, replaced by a patience and kindness that surprised everyone who knew him. He spent extra hours with Lena, teaching her things that were not in any textbook. He taught her how to breathe with the music, how to let the emotions flow through her without losing control, how to find the story hidden inside every piece. But he also learned from her. He watched the way she approached the piano, with a joy and freedom that he had lost long ago. He saw how she played not to impress anyone, but because the music was a part of her soul. And slowly, something began to change in him as well. One evening, about 3 months after Lena arrived at Hartwell, she was practicing in one of the smaller rooms when she heard a sound coming from down the hall. It was faint at first, almost like a memory of music rather than music itself. But as she listened, it grew clearer. Someone was playing La Campanella. Lena stopped practicing and walked toward the sound. The hallway was empty, lit only by the soft glow of lamps along the walls. The music was coming from the main concert hall, the one with the grand piano on the stage. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. There, alone on the stage, sat Maestro Harlow. His eyes were closed, his body swaying gently as his hands moved across the keys. He was playing La Campanella, the piece that had haunted him for more than 2 decades. The piece he had told himself he could never play again. He was not playing it perfectly. There were moments when his left hand stumbled, when the notes did not ring as clearly as they should. But he was playing it. For the first time in 23 years he was playing it. Lena stood in the doorway and watched, her heart full. She did not make a sound. She did not want to interrupt this moment that belonged only to him. When the piece ended, Maestro Harlow sat still for a long moment. Then he opened his eyes and saw her standing there. He smiled, and it was the most genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. "It's not perfect," he said. "It may never be perfect again. But that's not the point, is it?" Lena shook her head. "No, sir. That's not the point," he nodded slowly. "You taught me that. You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. It was never about being perfect. It was about feeling something, about sharing that feeling with others." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had failed him so many times. "I spent so many years being angry at these hands. I blamed them for taking away my dream. But they didn't take anything. I did. I let my fear and my pride steal the joy that music once gave me." He stood up from the piano and walked to the edge of the stage. "Thank you, Lena. Thank you for giving an old man a second chance." Lena felt tears welling up again, but she blinked them away. "You gave me a second chance first," she said. "I think we're even." Maestro Harlow laughed, a real laugh that echoed through the empty hall. It was a sound that no one at Hartwell had heard in years. The months turned into years. Lena grew from a nervous teenager into a confident young woman. She won her first competition at 18, a regional event that earned her a small scholarship. At 19, she placed second in a national competition, losing by just a few points to a pianist who had been training since he was 4 years old. At 20, she won the International Young Artists Competition, one of the most prestigious events in the classical music world. But it was not the awards that mattered most to her. It was the music. It was the feeling she got every time she sat down at a piano and let her fingers find the keys. It was the connection she felt with audiences who listened with tears in their eyes. It was the knowledge that she was doing exactly what her grandmother had always believed she would do. She brought her family to Vienna for her 21st birthday. Her mother cried when she saw the concert hall where Lena would perform. Her father stood in the entrance for a long time, looking around with an expression of wonder. Her little brother, who was not so little anymore, kept taking pictures of everything, saying he wanted to remember every detail that night. Lena performed La Campanella for the first time in front of a full audience. The hall was packed with people from all over Europe, critics and musicians and ordinary people who just loved music. In the front row sat her family, dressed in their best clothes, holding hands and trying not to cry, and beside them sat Maestro Harlow. He was older now, his hair completely white, his movements slower than they used to be. He had retired from teaching the year before, but he had made a special trip to Vienna for this concert. He would not have missed it for anything in the world. When Lena walked onto the stage, the audience applauded politely. She sat down at the piano and looked out at the sea of faces. She found her mother's eyes first, then her father's, then her brother's. And finally, she found the maestro's. He gave her a small nod, and she understood everything it meant. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music filled the hall like light filling a dark room. It was the same piece she had played at her audition all those years ago, but it was different now. It was richer, deeper, more alive. She had grown so much since that day, and the music had grown with her. When she reached the final notes, she struck them with everything she had. The sound rang out, pure and clear, and then faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The hall was completely still, and then the audience rose to their feet. The applause was like thunder, rolling through the hall in waves. People were cheering and calling out her name. Some of them had tears streaming down their faces. Lena stood and bowed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She looked at her family and saw them clapping and crying, pride shining in their eyes. She looked at Maestro Harlow and saw him standing as well, his old hands coming together slowly but firmly, a smile on his face that seemed to light up the entire room. She thought about her grandmother, who had first placed her small hands on the keys of that old broken piano so many years ago. She thought about the church where she had learned to play, the rain on the tin roof, the sound of her grandmother humming along to the music. She had come so far. She had overcome so much. And this was just the beginning. Later that night, after the concert was over and the crowds had gone home, Lena sat alone in the empty hall. She ran her fingers lightly over the piano keys, not playing anything, just feeling them beneath her touch. Maestro Harlow found her there. He walked slowly down the aisle and sat in one of the front row seats, letting out a tired but contented sigh. "You know," he said, "when you first walked into that audition, I thought you were just another dreamer who would fade away like all the rest. I was so certain that I knew everything there was to know about talent and success." He shook his head, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "I was a fool." Lena smiled. "You weren't a fool. You were just lost. We all get lost sometimes." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something glistening in his old eyes. "Your grandmother was right about you," he said quietly. "You were meant for something more, and I am grateful every day that I got to witness it." Lena felt a tear slide down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in me, even when you didn't want to." Maestro Harlow smiled. "Thank you for reminding me that music is not about perfection. It's about the human heart. And your heart, my dear, is the most beautiful instrument I have ever heard. They sat together in the silence of the empty hall, two people from different worlds who had found each other through the language of music. Outside, the city of Vienna sparkled under the stars. And somewhere, in a small coastal town on the other side of the world, an old church piano sat waiting for the next pair of hands to bring it to life. The end.